Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar. The webinar will last approximately 45 minutes, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. You can post these in the comments section on the channel there, and they will pop up on the screen so we can review them at the end. Today's webinar is sort of focused on what we call Agile market research. And we'll be going sort of through the areas here, looking at what exactly we mean by Agile market research, what the sort of purpose of this is and how it relates to the interaction of the research agency and the sort of the industry, the business development that we're looking at. So some of the topics we'll be covering today, looking at just a sort of a brief introduction and background to what we mean, looking at what the purpose of market research is and how Agile is being used in business, the differences that have occurred over the sort of developments of the research industry and business processes and how those are slightly divergent at the moment, some of these sort of threats to market research as it stands, and then we'll be sort of focusing on what Agile market research really means and how it all brings that back together, some of the sort of technologies and issues that arise from this and have to be overcome by industries, and then look at the sort of the conclusion of it, or the opportunities where everything sits for our research companies. So first of all, as I said, we're going to look at the sort of the purpose of research, market research. What role does it play? So, why have companies traditionally looked to the market research sector, conducted market research? Well, initially, companies obviously are there to derive commercial value. They operate on a sort of a profit basis. They're looking at maximizing their returns, and this often needs insight from the data that's there, the ability to derive decisions, derive the sort of the whole market attitude from asking the right types of questions. Now, research provides obviously this information to help those management decisions, to support the development of products, the direction of marketing, to sort of even look at the focus and the attitudes of consumers towards products, and all those insights are used to inform the business development process, the decisions companies make. And really, what research is looking at is understanding why things happen. Business has information and capabilities themselves on exactly how much is bought. They're very good at collecting that quantifiable data, but research really positions itself as getting to the understanding, the reasoning and the logic behind why things happen, why consumers or other businesses interact with companies as they do. So if we look at sort of how business operates, we get an understanding of sort of what exactly the research process is and how that fits in traditionally in both how we see Agile market research developing. So when we talk about Agile business processes, what we're really looking at is sort of the way companies interact now. Now, companies always try and base their business decisions on the best possible information at the latest possible moment. Now, obviously, the latest possible moment is a sort of subjective area. Things are always changing, data's always moving. Your competitors reposition themselves continuously. So there's always an aspect of trying to be at least at the latest possible moment with the best possible information to inform your decision-making process. Taking a decisions for a year's time, now there's so much that can happen. And we can see that in sort of the economies globally, especially in the current economic climate. Businesses are also looking at sort of how that information is becoming more real time. The way data flows, the ability to be able to gain access to huge amounts of data across the globe in real time, easily accessible. The amount of sort of open source data means that the research itself has to try and match that. It has to be as real time as possible to match these business processes. And obviously, making sort of those large decisions, business decisions that span many years, it always used to be the sort of golden rule. You could, see a niche in the market, develop a product for it, and put that, after sort of months of research, put that out to the industry. Things are much more quicker moving now because of that real-time information. So the decisions have to be in shorter processes. The development cycles have to be shorter processes, and they have to react to what's happening in the market, to any market changes or forces, to any influences and feedback from the consumers. So business processes have actually developed. The traditional approach, and this will sort of resonate with a lot of product managers out there, from the sort of the Prince approach, the waterfall approach, is where we used to see this even with larger companies such as Microsoft. Office 2007 was followed sort of 3 years later by Office 2010, and you saw the sort of Windows 95, then 3 years later Windows 98, and different things like that as the approaches went on. It was a big bang approach. A product was developed with the research and the feedback integrated into it, but over a much longer period. So you almost got full development and then a delivery of a complete product. Now, obviously, this has sort of been an approach for business for millennia, where we're now in a very different world, a very much more engaged electronic world, where things have to happen faster. So the approaches have developed in business, and they've taken on a much more sort of agile, lean approach, lean principles, Scrum development techniques. And this is really that the business process has become a very much more continuous, reiterative, cyclical process. There's lots of smaller steps, a lot of inbuilt learning in the process there, and a lot of adjustment continuously on the feedback, the research that's coming into the business opportunities. So if we look at sort of a typical business process, how they work through their information, how they sort of develop their understanding of the world. And usually we'll see this as a sort of a very small steps, quick agile processes. Typically 2-week cycles. Each development cycle has this inbuilt sort of feedback loop. They're looking at smaller releases. The testing's always in there. The sort of the user testing, that research feedback on how a customer would interact with a product, or with the impact of any marketing campaign. All of these are done in very, very small steps, continuously looked at sort of with both developers, clients, users in the cycle. And there's always a sort of a feedback loop in these areas as well, with also sort of smaller releases to market. So typically things sort of like your sort of Chrome browser or the Google operating system or mobile phones. We're looking at sort of Apple, and their operating systems are occasionally sort of released more often, but the apps on there sort of are updated without knowing. You often find that there's been a sort of a new release, you don't even know about it, it's just downloaded, installed, and that's instant, and it's coming continuously. So there's no longer a sort of here's a big bang approach, and more businesses are doing this. They're getting their sort of releases quicker to market, they're making continuous improvements, and all this is happening in a very, very quick cycle. It's using that sort of feedback from the smaller releases to drive the next decision-making process. Now we'll look at sort of how understanding how that business process works. We'll look at sort of how market research is developed and how it's slightly diverging from some of the business practices, the sort of the new innovative practices, the lean practices that are there. So typically, market research processes work through a sort of a series of stages. The research was defined and discussed with the client, starting with the sort of the whole of the sample build, what questions were going to be asked, when and to who, what the target audience was, and almost sort of predetermining every single step up front. So you're sort of looking at a longer process there. The reporting framework is always predetermined as well, because you've set what your sort of sampling property is going to be, who your target audience is. You're looking at sort of how that report is going to be presented to the client, what information is going to be there, and those sort of decisions are almost building up how your process is going to work, what aspects of research are going to be undertaken. So it's put into a sort of a very linear approach, predetermined, and could possibly be over, a few weeks, months, even sort of 6 months. Continuous tracking studies aren't unheard of, and are sort of pretty defined ahead of time. So we typically see something like a sort of very sort of linear approach there. So, the sample is defined, your target audience on there. You define some of the quantitative field work, and even if it is a qual study, there will be a sort of small quant element in there that may be the screener, the sort of reconfirmation, verification of those sample properties. You'll work through some of the qual there to sort of get more information on there, more feedback in the system, looking at sort of more of the why reasoning that research is so strong in. But obviously that needs to be presented. So there's a coding step to take all of that data, the unstructured data from qual work, and put it into a sort of a cone frame that can then be reported on, and you get your sort of tables, charts, presentations out there, visualizations there. So it's a very sort of set process that is step by steps and moves through the different steps throughout that life cycle of a research project, with each of the steps being sort of almost set up, determined before the commencement of this. So it is that sort of really is the essence of where the changes are, where the differences lie between the business process now and the research project lifecycle as it stands. Market research is sort of serialized event there. It's become that sort of process, and it very much followed how the traditional business development was, the waterfall approach, the Prince approach to development. And those serialized events are, by default now in larger agencies, it's the movement between different departments, with each department sort of taking care of its step within that process and passing on the completed information to the next department. So you get a very sort of blocked approach to research, and even smaller agencies have their specializations. Sort of smaller SOHO agencies, boutique agencies, maybe do not have the resources there to be able to do the full chain. They specialize in one particular area. They might be sort of incredibly good at the mystery shopping feedback, the analysis of that, or online focus groups and sort of managing those, and they have that sort of specialized role in there, and that's a great position to be in. But it still needs to be sort of fit into the entire process. So you get to the stage where, as these blocks of research are being moved throughout that process, you're getting further and further away from the relevance of the data. It's not as real time as it should be, and therefore those business decisions are no longer at the latest, the last possible moment. It's based on some historic data. And historic may be a sort of a day later, but the way information flows are working now, that's a long time. So what we're sort of really looking at is how we can address this sort of serialized approach, make the sort of the changes to the way market research operates to get it more in line with the business process. And we have to look at some of the sort of the threats that are out there that are also influencing why this process needs to be aligned and changed. Now, if we look at some of the things that have happened recently and the sort of empowerment that this has given to businesses themselves, there is a sort of a threat to some of the research industry. In the way that sort of DIY platforms have come out, so the SurveyMonkey, and there's been discussion about how this impacts on research, a good or bad thing. Obviously, it empowers businesses to be able to conduct their own quantifiable research in a fairly, I would say, simplistic fashion on there. Obviously, the experienced fieldwork agencies are able to look at sort of more of the intricacies. They have the knowledge about the sort of bias and influencing factors that could be there in a survey, and how you can influence respondents by the way you ask questions. But to businesses just seeking quick feedback, quick quantifiable data, the DIY tools empower them that way, so they are able to match, sort of gain that insight in their own internal resources, their own internal fashions. Having that match with the sort of the big data that's flowing there, the CRM systems, these two can integrate together. So it gives business the ability to match their own internal customer databases, their own knowledge of the products, the advertising, the marketing they're doing, mix those in with the DIY quantifiable data they're receiving, and also have that sort of more relevance to their business. They have the opportunities themselves to do a lot of that research. And this is, something that obviously research companies need to address and look at themselves and try and mirror this, make the best opportunities of it. And we also see the way that traditional business structures are changing. The exponential organization, or EXOs as they're known, such as, we put here Airbnb and Uber. There's many out there now where it's more of a wider collaborative offering that's there. A lot of it's not sort of specialists that are providing the services. It's the mass market, the consumers that are all being able to participate actively within a business structure. And the possibilities there to sort of expand and grow field work, having perhaps utilizing any individual anywhere as your interviewer, that can give you that sort of ability to compete on a different level. There's a different playing field coming in. And whilst this, at the moment, the EXOs are sort of putting pressures on traditional companies, this is also going to sort of obviously flow through into the market research area. There's going to be changes to how sort of research companies themselves are structured, their reach, their capabilities, their sort of outsourcing and looking for the best possible fits from different structures than different companies, different organizations, societies, to be able to engage more people and to be able to be flexible quickly and change to match that market. So some of the sort of the issues that market research has to then look at in addressing this, and this is just a sort of a few pointers there so that we can sort of tackle some of the sort of threats, the issues, the opportunities that may arise from that. Obviously, quantitative data is it's very reliable. It's very solid. When people sort of give you a yes/no answer, you've got a quantifiable amount there. You can count that, you can position that, you can compare it. But obviously, various different systems, softwares out there, there's no industry-wide format. So merging all of these different sources together, being able to sort of utilize that data quickly becomes somewhat difficult because of not having a standard. The qualitative data, it's providing the why. It's exceptionally good at that. It's sort of part of what market research's focus has been, and we've developed much more techniques on qualitative. It's been much more innovative than some of the quantitative side of things. So the qual, looking at emotion detection, looking at sort of tracking people's movements across different websites and their responses to it, their verbatims, the social media chats and tagging that's going on. All this is much more rich data, but it's unstructured. It's not following a very simple format for that quickness, that speed that you want to be able to provide that real-time insight in there. So there's challenges on getting the unstructured data into a format quickly so that the business process can work, the information and flow from market research can match those quick agile turnovers. And also looking at sort of the unstructured, recoding, manipulating data, getting it into the format that's required for the reporting purposes to feed in those visualizations and dashboards that are essential to informing how things are happening, what's going on in the marketplace. It means that there needs to be more of the sort of the automation process there, the machine learning, the intelligence built into the background of it. And obviously, all of this means that that we need to have this as best possible. We need the valid data so that businesses' decisions can be accurate, they can be appropriate, and they can be timely. So there's a lot of sort of issues there that need to be overcome and merged together to unlock this potential from the Agile research set. And when we sort of look at the data caption there, the time-based one is the crucial one there. The more elements you put in there, the more complexity of the data, the longer that workflow is, that serialization is, and the further away from the decision process and the understanding that it gets. But there's always a sort of a balance to be matched there, on how much time there is as to sort of what the insight is, how accurate it can be. So all of that gives us sort of background of where we're going towards Agile market research and what we mean by it. And we're just going to take a sort of a quick overview now of how Agile market research can work, what it really means. So what we're looking at in here is sort of matching some of those processes, looking at the opportunities there, and trying to gain the quick mindset, the continuous surveying, the continuous feedback, the development of customization of your surveys as it's going on. So we look at this in sort of three main elements there. Looking at the sort of sample, the target universe, you're looking at the derivation of this. Now, obviously, embedding into the business process, getting access to those CRM systems, the customer lists, even sort of river sampling there, getting a drive in there. So the sample is very much on demand. It's very much a continuous flow feeding into your centralized system. So you can then always have sample available. And you can be flexible on that. You can sort of derive where that sample is going to go and feed it into multiple surveys, or feed it at different points in your survey and your different sort of research process. We see that the fieldwork becomes more step by step. It's more event driven. You have smaller survey parts there, smaller questionnaire parts that may be isn't predefined. It may be adjusted as you are deriving information from your research process. So whilst you sort of have an idea of you're going to go through a quant survey, you're then going to do a sort of some sort of sampling there, verification process. You might then proceed on to a focus group and then have a sort of a feedback after that. Those might be broken down into smaller sections. They may even have different people going into them depending on what you've learned. So it might be that at your screener, you're learning that certain behavior is happening there, that you're losing certain targets there. So you maybe want to adjust the next part of the qualitative step and have different people going into slightly different qualitative events, but trying to provide that same feedback mechanism, the same processes there, trying to give that information back and the insight back to all of the sort of participants in that process. And that's why you need to have that sort of that learning and adjusting, revising why you're doing something, looking for those sort of small snippets of information that would decide the next step in your research process. But having that continuous, having it in a very sort of flexible and dynamic way, so you can adjust the way a question is asked. You can adjust the next stage on it. You can adjust where the flow of a individual, given their characteristics, through your survey process. And it's very much sort of the mindset of not having a predefined long-term step-by-step process, but being able to adjust it, review it continuously, and derive the best elements, best information from that. So what we really need to do this is then to look at sort of, adjust our positioning, adjust the market research concepts to readdress, again, the basic rules of business, to look at providing that best possible information at the latest possible moment. It's being able to sort of influence that. And obviously we've seen a growth in the drive towards the sort of predictive modeling in market research, and also the visualization of data, so you're able to see exactly where things are happening. We need to sort of be able to use all the source data there in all the formats and structures, being able to merge in your data from those open source databases to be able to sort of continuously adjust your sort of target universe based on government statistics and when they're updated, to be able to continuously pull in information from social media, from the Twitter feeds, to be able to pull in information on when advertising is hitting the sort of radios, TVs, the impact of that. So you've got time-based measurements in there. And whilst all this data is coming in and maybe in very different formats, there's always going to be a need to be able to reformat that continuously, automatically, be able to apply those rules on there and have it in a usable structure within sort of your centralized database, so that you can always access that information. It's always there. It's always in the sort of the right format for you to be able to merge it into different survey tools, different qual tools, to be able to really gain access to the best possible information. And also, as we talked about, being flexible, dynamic, being responsive. The research agency itself needs to be able to adjust in a sort of agile process. That 2-week cycle we had in the business process, where it was continuously learning, giving out information at smaller times, making the changes, getting the feedback, and readjusting continuously, so that the data is always relevant. It's always driving the next step of the research process, what the next sort of why things are happening, those questions that are arising, and adjusting that research continuously, so you are giving that business process back in the most relevant form as it can be. Which means obviously rejecting that serialized approach, rejecting the setup of a research process from beginning to end with the steps predefined, with the report almost sort of starting to be structured and written whilst field work is still ongoing. It really needs to have that dynamic flow, so that a report that starts off on the first day may be completely different from the end one, because you've gained those insights. You've gained that sort of little trigger within the research after the first day that says, hang on, we should be asking a question slightly differently. We should be going down this different methodology. There's something more interesting there, more appropriate for what my customer, my client, my business that I'm advising needs to get out of this information, needs to get out of their initial sort of premise that they've given us. And that really does mean a different mindset coming into play. But obviously, this needs a sort of different approaches to it. So what we're really looking at is being able to have your centralized area of your sampling, your coding frames already set up, so that you can, at any point of time, go into quant, qual, you can produce tables and charts. All these are dynamic. It's no longer serialized. You can just enter into any one of these points at any time. It's all feeding back from a centralized database. It gives you that capability to be flexible, to be agile, to be able to be responsive, to be of the moment. And it's really sort of how business is working. So you're trying to match that cyclical move, always having data churning in a cyclical approach within your database, being accessible to inform those decisions. Obviously, trying to get to that, trying to have those capabilities there are technical issues that need to be overcome. A company may be wanting to adopt an agile mindset, but as we saw earlier, there are issues that are embedded into the process. There are things that need to be addressed so that you can be as quick and flexible as that data can flow to you in producing what you need to advise your clients, your customers. So some of the things we need to look at is obviously handling these disparate data sets. Or there's different information flowing in, the Twitter feeds, the social media, the government statistics, your quant data, your qual data, your sample data, your CRM system data. All of this is all sort of coming in different formats, different flows, and needs to be handled. It needs to be centralized, and it needs to be able to be merged together and utilized. You need to also then provide that data on demand. It needs to feed the visualizations, feed the reports, feed the knowledge that is going out which will then help drive those future decisions, help you make those changes to your process that the data is telling you, and making them as short, as quick as possible. If you don't make those changes sort of that you see in day one, and it takes you a week to make them, there could be several different changes already happened since then, and you're already out of date. All of your sort of your research becomes less and less valid the way that you don't react quickly. Because obviously we've got to look at then is balancing that quality and depth of research with the delivery time. So whilst it's great to be able to adjust instantly, you may miss that quality, you may miss the depth there. Getting that balance of looking at the why may require examining people's behavior over time, and so there is always going to be that driving factor of having instant data, having instant feedback, but how does that relate? How does that change over time? So time-based information is going to be equally important, and being able to track those changes and having the access to that extra information to see why that may have changed is also going to be crucial to the agile mindset, the agile market research process. Which finally leads us to delivering data relevant to the business. Looking at those historical trends, how things have changed, getting that data into a business process, really looking at being part of the business process, part of the development there, so that research is informing in real time as much as possible what decisions should be made. So what can we draw from all of this? When we talk about the agile market research, what do we see as some of the opportunities, the challenges that are coming and facing market research? So the future of market research is basically an opportunity, and it consists of these different factors. Making market research part of that changing business process, matching the cyclical movement, being more agile, being more responsive, embedding itself into the research process, being part of the whole company philosophy and development and drive on that agile cycle. When it's embedded in there, it's going to be crucial to do that feedback, to be part of that service. And whilst it's probably less likely to be on the quantifiable side of things, that still will be there, that's still offering, but balancing all that quant data that a company has with some of the why, the real reasoning behind it, and then matching those processes together, that needs to be embedded in that cycle. It needs to be part of the feedback cycle that businesses are having continuously and every 2 weeks as going on, so that becomes more and more of a flow in the whole business market research partnership. The relationship between those companies becomes stronger and tighter together, so you can do things quicker, you can provide the type of service and the level of service that is expected. And this just means then utilizing technology. There are many different technologies out there, but they have to be able to be matched with business technologies, with business processes, has to be able to embed itself into those different points of the organization, so that things can really develop, really step up to how business is working and operating currently, how it's going to continue to develop, and how it's going to become even shorter timescales. And without having that technology in place, without being able to address those issues of different data formats, of the flow of data, merging data sets, putting in the understanding, the coding in there, and being able to embed that completely to the business process, so it's matching exactly the information that business is having, and being embedded in there, means that technology is going to be crucial in getting to that position, being able to position yourself as an agile research company, and utilizing the whole benefits of that quick cyclical turnaround. So that was the presentation for this morning, the overview of the market research, agile market research on there. Obviously, this is looking at it from our understanding of business, our development cycles in there, looking at how research is traditionally working. But what we're trying to give you is a flavour of how the research is changing, and we'll be looking at in sort of future webinars of how Nebu is going to respond to this, what Nebu is doing about it, how we're looking at sort of addressing certain stages throughout that agile process. So those will come into play later on. Now, as I said, we've sort of gone through the process for you, the agile there, and I hope it's sparked a lot of different questions that are coming up. And what we'd really like to see now is sort of invite anyone to sort of plug in those questions, and I'll see what we've got on the different areas there, see if we've got any questions that come up. Yeah, we've got them there about the length. Is it always a 2 week? No, the 2 week cycle. Obviously, this may seem sort of a very short term for some of the surveying, some of the research that's happening in the industry. Not all businesses are working on a 2 week cycle. This is just sort of a typical example of what will happen there. Obviously, it depends on the sort of the industry, the way they develop, the way they're sort of working and processing can be sort of much more different themselves. Sort of a new release of a car still happens sort of once or twice every sort of couple of years. It doesn't evolve that quickly. However, different elements of it are always changing. So there's always going to be smaller elements that are being addressed, feedback that's happening on there, and continuous development of a product there. We've seen recently someone like Renault say that they're having chips put into the tires that will automatically feed back the use, the driving capabilities, and when those tires should be replaced. That's looking at sort of the Internet of Things and the data flow that's going to come out there. So 2 weeks isn't sort of an exact on there, and it's never going to be an exact science. It's always going to be adjusted to match the rhythm of the business process. So the market research should be sort of adjusting itself and its positioning to match that rhythm, that market research, the sort of the business process that's happening, the agile process that's going on. Another one here. Yeah, different technologies. Well, obviously, the sort of technologies that are in place. I talk about sort of social media capturing and that. I think the focus sort of from research on technology at the moment seems to be very much on the visualization. A lot of the sort of papers that have been at a lot of the conferences recently have been looking at either the topic is sort of the visualization or the prediction, the data modeling type of aspects, and these are obviously sort of whilst presented as research topics, presented as more of the case studies areas they're all based on having those technologies available, being able to sort of utilize the newer technologies that have come up to gain that insight. And whilst some people say sort of research is quite slow in adopting different techniques, I think we've seen over the years a greater drive to adopt new technologies, to become more innovative, but it seems to have been sort of slightly more piecemeal. We've got the sort of the capability of utilizing people's cameras. Everyone has a camera with them all the time. Mobile phones have had cameras in them for several years now. But it's only recently that utilizing that technology to get the feedback, to look at the emotional stance, is coming into play in research. And I think it'll be sort of even quicker developments, even quicker cycles that people are looking at to try and use technologies to really drive their whole positioning in the market, their whole ability to match those business processes again, to be able to really get the full benefit of technology advancements, to open new revenues, to increase the flows, to be able to sort of gain where they are in that process. And just one other. Yeah. No, sorry. When I talked about sorry, there's just a question here about sort of the some of the threats in there as well. When I was talking about the sort of the DIY market there, I don't necessarily see that business is going to remove research from its or the market research industry from its development processes. Um, the sort of growth of the DIY tools enables businesses to do much more sort of evaluation, much more feedback processes themselves, but it's still not giving them that sort of the why, not giving them the whole element, the whole sort of reasoning behind why market research exists. There's only so much you can do with data, but you need to know how to interpret it. You need to know how to analyze it. You need to have that wealth of experience that research industries have to be able to look at data and deduct from it the real focus, the real attentions there. So, no, whilst those are sort of threats on there, they're also opportunities. They're also showing to industries that utilize DIY technologies that there is still the element of understanding, interpretation, and the knowledge that is needed to really make sense of the figures, the facts that are being presented, and to make sure that that feeds into the business decision process at the most appropriate time, is interpreted in the correct way. So yeah, it's one of those sort of, a lot of people have done debates at different conferences over DIY and the impact of it and the threats to research. But personally, I see it as a great opportunity to introduce more companies to the benefits of conducting research. So I don't see it as necessarily as a huge threat. Okay, well, so all sort of the comments, questions there. Obviously, if there are any more, you can always sort of contact anyone at Nebu, discuss this further. Be happy to sort of talk this over with different people. And as I said, in future webinars, we'll be looking at more of the elements, more of the sort of technologies behind the Agile approach, and showing sort of how those can be utilized to get the best out of this. I thank you for your time this morning, and look forward to seeing you again very soon in another webinar. Thank you.